So I think it's safe to say at this point that Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 is absolutely the most anticipated Zelda release of all time, as we saw Zelda Breath of the Wild truly do new sales numbers that have never been achieved before. We saw them completely overhaul the Zelda experience and turn it into an open world experience and an open world gameplay setting. And while I loved that entire story from start to finish, an entire experience from start to finish, there's a few changes that I'm holding out hope for that Nintendo will implement in Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, or the sequel to Breath of the Wild, to truly be the best Zelda game of all time. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below, hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. Now guys, today I'm super excited to talk about one of my most anticipated titles of the year for sure, if not ever, and that is Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, and that's because we have confirmation, of course, that this game is in development, but it has been well over a year now since we've gotten any form of an update. We know to expect Ganondorf in the story, we know to expect obviously Zelda in the story, and maybe even her as a playable character. But while I was personally a huge fan of the original Breath of the Wild, it is not my top ranking Zelda game of all time, simply because there are some elements missing from the Zelda franchise and the Zelda formula as a whole on that game that I really hope Nintendo actually implements in the sequel. And if they meld the best of both worlds together with an open world experience and some of these story elements that I'm going to be covering in a top 5 list today that I think we need to see in the sequel of Breath of the Wild, I think it stands to reason that this could be the best overall Zelda experience of all time. So we have to talk about the 5 changes that Nintendo will hopefully slow down and deliver in Breath of the Wild to truly make this the best Zelda experience ever. So the first thing, and honestly the most important in my book, is traditional dungeons coming back to the Zelda experience, as I do think that was something that was sorely missing. The Divine Beast did not scratch that itch for me at all. I do think that they were fun little puzzle trials, like mini dungeons you could argue that they were, but they were so repetitive in the way that once you completed one Divine Beast, you almost knew exactly what to expect from every other Divine Beast, just with little tweaks. Same thing goes for all of the shrines, where they were very spread out. They had tons of them in the game, but they ended up feeling repetitive after 100+ shrines. Even though they're all different types of puzzles, you walk in and know what to expect from start to finish. And I hope that Nintendo really slows down and does some more traditional style dungeons where you actually unlock specific items or abilities. There's obviously this mystical hand that Link has in the original Breath of the Wild trailer that we don't know what to expect, what all that is going to offer in terms of functionality and gameplay. But I think it makes a lot of sense if Nintendo gives us more of the traditional style item progression, where we conquer a dungeon that is a long dungeon from start to finish, and we hopefully see like 8 to 10 of these total dungeons in the overall story, and you walk out of each of those with maybe a new ability from your hand. Like maybe your hand turns into what the hook shot would be, or what the boomerang or bow and arrow would be. Maybe, you know, we slowly unlock Link's upgrades, as opposed to how the items were set up in the original Breath of the Wild, because I do think that this would be a very welcome change. According to most Zelda fans, if you look online, especially the older hardcore Zelda fans that played all of the originals, that was probably the one biggest, most overall complaint that you see online, is that as much as the open world experience is great, it does feel like this was Nintendo's first attempt at that, and that they did leave out some of the unique themed dungeons. Because I love it to conquer a forest temple, and then a fire temple, and then a water temple, and they all have totally unique styles, and they all have different types of puzzles and different types of challenges, and you also walk out with a new unique weapon or ability at the end of those dungeons. And I would even love to just see the common formula of the boss key coming back and then doing the final boss fight, and let that progress the story elements, and hopefully some big giant cutscenes to set up what boss you're going to be taking on in each individual temple, and also even progressing the story a little bit further at a time, almost like they did in Majora's Mask, where you kind of knew you were conquering each dungeon to ultimately set up the giant giants to catch the moon, so that way you could then go to the moon yourself and fight the final boss. And while you didn't know exactly what to expect, you kind of started to get an overall picture of where things were headed with the story as you continued to progress and conquer dungeons. And I hope we see something similar to that in Breath of the Wild 2, and it's absolutely my number one thing that I am hoping that we see in this sequel as we get closer and closer to release. The next thing that I think Nintendo really needs to put some focus around and absolutely revise or revisit in some way, shape, or form is the weapon durability system. As while I do love how Breath of the Wild did force you to play with a number of different style of weapons because of them continuing to break and not really having a way to recharge the durability, it also offered some frustration for me specifically, as I typically like to pick a direction for my character in games like this. I'll even compare it to a Dark Souls style series, because that's really what I hope we see them do with weapon durability, which is that you can pick a primary sword or primary weapon that you want to progress through the game with, and while it will degrade in durability as you continue to use it, there is some type of reset for that durability, so you don't just totally have to break that weapon and walk away from it. And that's what I hope Nintendo does implement in this sequel to Breath of the Wild, because I think it would be very cool if you unlock some giant mega swords or something that's different even than the Master Sword, and maybe the Master Sword ends up being the end game sword, but it's something that you can actually pick and build your character around, and one that you like the moveset of over other swords in the game, and you don't have to be so concerned about, is the swords that I like to use about to break before I go take down this Lionel or any of the major bosses that are in Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. So I hope we see some kind of reset or recharge durability mechanic, whether that be like resting at a campfire, or whether that be something where it's an item that you can go ahead and restock on and stock up on, so you will always have the option to play with the weapon that you like the most in this new title from start to finish. So it's something I definitely hope we see Nintendo revise in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Coming in at number 3 on the wish list of changes for Breath of the Wild 2, I hope that we get the darkest overall story we have seen in a Zelda title at any point, and I hope that there is a bunch of focus around building this throughout the game as you progress, with very immersive cutscenes and very immersive soundtrack. I want the whole package for this. I want to feel like we know that we have to stop this version of Ganondorf that is presented to us in the game, because it'll simply be the destruction of everything if we don't. And I hope that there's a lot of up close looks at how this is going to affect the characters in the world overall, maybe the champions and how it will affect all of them and their individual inhabitants. I want that full connected painted story picture, which I do think the original Zelda Breath of the Wild did a great job with, but they were so kind of cryptic on the story elements. There were even all of the memories that were actually totally optional to go back and find and experience the story. So I feel like you can obviously miss out on a huge portion of the story in Zelda Breath of the Wild if you didn't play it correctly, or if you just aren't that style of a player to begin with. But I think that allows a lot of things to be missed in the overall narrative of how this sets up the Zelda story. The other big thing that I hope they focus on with this darker, more mature, more aged story would be something like a connection to the overall Zelda timeline. As for me personally, as a fan of Zelda over all these years, when we get a clear painted picture of where the title sits in the timeline, it sets up a grander style story for me, and I get more immersed and more pulled in, like the opening cutscene of the Wind Waker, where it explains what happened with the hero of time and how there needs to be a new hero, and you end up being the hero of the wind after thousands of years have passed. And you know that they are referencing Ocarina of Time's hero, who is Link at that time, and other games like Skyward Sword that obviously make themselves the de facto, like this is the first story in the entire Zelda timeline. So stuff like that, where they're setting up a giant broader narrative and you know that it's somehow connecting in with other Zelda titles in the franchise, is huge for me. And so I hope that that will be featured in the story alongside with more mandatory cutscenes and more great deep dark storytelling, and more of a threat of what will happen if we cannot defeat this version of Ganondorf that is obviously unleashed in this land of Hyrule. Coming in at number 4 in the list is arguably one of the most important enhancements, if not any of the others that we've talked about, and that is the actual frame rate of the game, because originally Zelda Breath of the Wild was developed for the Wii U, and it started to get so close to the release of the Switch, or the rumored NX at the time, that we saw a dual release on both of these consoles. And I do think you could argue that there was some limitations that were put into place on this title because of the Wii U hardware. And when you start to see all the rumors pop up about the Switch Pro, which I am absolutely predicting that we will get, and hopefully this year, I think Nintendo has to make this game run at the bare minimum in docked at 60 frames per second, and it needs to be at least 1080p, as the previous maximum was 900p at 30 frames per second while docked. And I do think that you can clearly see a difference in the better frame rate and the overall smoothness of the game as you see PC modders who have taken upon themselves to actually upgrade this, and it truly changes your experience, and you see the true beauty of this open world environment that they created. And so I think Nintendo cannot stutter on the frame rate. Obviously there's going to be limitations to something like a Switch Lite or even the base model Switch in handheld mode, but whether or not it comes to the base model Switch, we need to see a Switch revision at some point, and we need to see that at least feature 60 frames per second at 1080p, hopefully with like DLSS allowing for an upscaled 4K native resolution with still 60 frames per second, which I do think would be possible on something like a Switch revision, especially if we see it launch at the higher rumored price points of the $350 to $400 launch like we are seeing reports of online. So I think if Nintendo does do this overall Switch revision like we're expecting them to, they have to make sure this game runs at the bare minimum 60 frames per second. The last item on our list for today is absolutely the soundtrack, and while I love the Breath of the Wild soundtrack, it is so few and far between when you hear it ramp up, and I do get what Nintendo is trying to accomplish with that. I think they left it silent for a little bit too long in broad areas, in my opinion, as there is something that I miss about going into a vast new Hyrule field or an open area and having the soundtrack kick up in the background. And I think they strategically saved it, obviously, for boss fights or big encounters in Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I think they wanted to kind of feature, you know, all of the wildlife that is around, and you kind of hear the birds chirp and you hear the different creatures that are roaming around. That was a really cool experience for the original. Now I think they need to give us some of that, but not too much of it, and I think that the more they can capitalize on a grand orchestra style soundtrack for this game, I think the more it will pull players into the world, as opposed to wanting more from the background noise, as I personally did in the original Zelda Breath of the Wild. So this is another small quality of life improvement that I think will add more than people realize if Nintendo does implement a newer, broader soundtrack, and that one that plays more frequently throughout your exploration in Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. But I would love to know your guys' thoughts on what your personal top 5 list would be of changes that you hope we see to the Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel. So make sure you leave me that in the comments down below before you leave the video today, and also go vote in today's community poll, where I will be asking you guys if you hope that we do see the return of traditional dungeons and item exploration in this Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel. So make sure you check that out on the channel today before you leave the video. Thanks so much for watching the video today, everyone. I do truly appreciate you all sticking around until the end. I do at this point in the video want to invite you all one more time to join Sunbro Nation if you haven't done so already. Do so by subscribing below. Hit the like button on your way out on this video if you enjoyed it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. That's going to do it for me, guys. I hope you all have a great day. Sunbro Nation, out.